Ben, great to meet you, and thank you so much for doing this for us this evening in our community.
Hi, Caryn. Thank you so much. Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.
To be with you tonight. Thank you so much.
So Ben, we have so many questions to get to, and I want to mention again to those who are joining us tonight, our participants, please feel free to ask questions in the chat at any time, and I will do my best to keep an eye on it, and I promise that we will get to your questions, and I already see a whole bunch of greetings. Everybody's very excited for Ben to be with us, and as am I. So Ben, we'll jump into a conversation. I've so much to get to with you and your lovely book, which is so insightful and so eye-opening, and I just think this is such a wonderful time to talk about this, obviously during the celebration of Chanukah, the Festival of Light. So let's start with, the title of your book, Jewish Pride. So talk to us about, what is Jewish pride?
Jewish pride is a number of things. And I think it's also important to even preface with what I'm about to say by saying Jewish pride is both collective and individual. So we as a people of 15 million individuals will express our Jewish pride slightly differently. The main tenets of Jewish pride, the main messages of what I'm trying to convey is, first of all, in educating, inspiring, and empowering Jews to reject the shame of Jew hatred. We are very good at remembering our dead. We're very good at remembering the Shoah, the pogroms, the Farhud, other catastrophes that have befallen our people. One thing we have not been as successful at is understanding the emotional impact of experiencing this prejudice. And this prejudice, this Jew hate that we experience, it shames us. The non-Jewish worlds, which are hostile to us, they are trying to shame us. They're trying to say that we shouldn't be specifically Jewish, that we have to be universal, that to be accepted by wider society, we have to change ourselves. And the first message of this book is really saying, no, that is not true. We are fine just the way we are. We do not need to acquiesce to their demands. We do not need to warp or change our identities to be accepted. And really to help Jews of all ages build barriers to the shame that is being directed at us. The second point, which is really fundamentally important, is rejecting non-Jewish definitions of Jewish identity. And that may seem quite obvious, but the non-Jewish worlds in which we live, particularly in the Western world, they try to tell us what we are. They try to say that we are, just a religious group, or that we're this or we're that. And really the only people who get to define Jewish identity are Jews. And that is the same kind of standard that should be applied to all minority groups. I'm also a gay man, and I would not tolerate heterosexual society telling me what it meant to be a homosexual, just as Jews should not tolerate non-Jewish society telling us what it means to be a Jew. And, we know the old adage that you have 3 Jews and 15 opinions, right? So I'm sure even in this call, there's going to be Jews who would disagree with one another. And that's fine, because they're our disagreements to have, they're our conversations to have, and the non-Jewish world, our non-Jewish allies, should be listening, should be asking clarifying questions, but they should not be defining Jewish identity. And third of all, it's really educating, again, inspiring and empowering Jews of all ages, all over the world, to start a journey of exploration. Even if we are proud Jews, even if we feel really proudly Jewish and Zionist, we can still investigate our identities further. We can still learn more about what it means to be a Jew. And that has to be done through the framework of authentic Jewish experience, identity, and values.
Why, Ben, should we be focusing on Jewish pride right now?
That's a really great question. I believe that we are at a very kind of crucial and fundamental part of our experience, particularly our post-Shoah experience. There was an idea, again, particularly in the West, that after the Shoah, overt Jew hatred had been defeated. We knew it still existed, of course, but we thought maybe it existed more on the fringes of society. And in the last, 15, 10, 5 years, we've seen it creeping back to the center. And I say very clearly that Jew hate has been renormalized. In May, we saw the horrendous abuse that Jewish Canadians experienced during the war between Israel and Hamas. Just the other day, a busload of Jewish teenagers were attacked in central London, in Oxford Street. And I'm not sure if any of you know Oxford Street, but it's the shopping street in London. This was in the center of London, and this is happening all over the world. So it has been renormalized. So as once again we face this cyclical rise in Jew hate, we have to really be considering how we're going to respond to it. And one of the things I would say is that Jew hate is not a Jewish problem. It is a non-Jewish problem that impacts Jews. And that then means that we really need allies to solve it. We actually cannot solve this problem on our own. And I would say that it's not even really our job, because it's not possible. We cannot solve someone else's problem. We, of course, share our experiences, we dialogue. But what is our work? Our work is Jewish Pride, is again, educate, inspire, and empower Jews all over the world to see their Jewishness as a source of pride and never shame. Because as I said previously, the non-Jewish worlds, they try to shame us. They try to make us ashamed of our Jewishness. They try to make us qualify our Jewishness by saying, I'm Jewish but, or I'm Zionist but, or I'm Jewish. And I want to say that we have not survived for 4,000 years through the most kind of incredible and horrendous experiences for Jews today to allow the shame from the non-Jewish world to impact how we feel about ourselves. We may not be able to change how they feel about us, but we certainly can change how we feel about ourselves.
You know, it's interesting. I actually bookmarked your page when you talked about Jew hate as being not our problem. You know, it's one that we have to deal with, but it's not our problem. It's the non-Jewish world's problem. And I'll also mention, you know, some of these terrible current events that you just mentioned, you know, the massacre at the synagogue in Pittsburgh. We like to think these aren't happening in our backyard, but then they are happening in our backyard. We see it here in Toronto, sadly, regularly, and across Canada and in the United States. So yeah, it's definitely, it's an issue. I want to talk about Chanukah, because this is, of course, the celebration that we are marking this week, the Festival of Lights. And, you know, there's so many reasons to bring light into the world, especially now as we're dealing with this global pandemic, and you're on the other side of the world, and yet we can relate because we're all in this together. But what about Jewish pride? You know, how is Chanukah a celebration of that as well?
That's a really excellent and really important question. So last year, Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, released a Chanukah greeting with her husband, Doug Emhoff, who is Jewish. And she said she loves Chanukah because it's about Tikkun Olam. And I was thinking, no, it's not about Tikkun Olam. It's actually about the Jewish fight against assimilation. If we really try to understand the story of Chanukah, it was about the Hasmoneans, who were nicknamed the Maccabees, Judah HaMaccabee, fighting against cultural genocide. They were fighting against assimilation. You know, at that time, a gymnasium was built in Jerusalem, and that was kind of organized and orchestrated by a Jew. We had Jewish men in Greek-ruled Judea who were reversing their circumcisions because they wanted to be accepted by Greek society. And that is where we get into this conversation, which I'm sure we'll touch on a little later, about internalized anti-Jewishness. But the Greeks under Antiochus IV were trying to eradicate Jewishness. And what Chanukah was the refusal to allow them to do it. Something we see in every period of Jewish history is an undying commitment to Jewish life. We are obsessed with being Jewish in the best way. And the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, said, we're not going to allow you to destroy this. We're not going to allow you to destroy the civilization, because that is what we are. We're an ancient culture and civilization. We're not going to allow you to destroy this without us fighting back. And that is the model for all Jews today, because again, we experience this erasure, this watering down of Jewish identity. And I saw a rabbi on Twitter, an American rabbi, says, you know, we should stop drawing comparisons between the Maccabees and ourselves. And I really found that to be such an odd thing to say, because one of the most incredible things about the Jewish people is not just our commitment to Jewish life, but is our memory. You know, we have been committed to remembering the past. And if we're not going to remember, how our ancestors, who many of us are directly related to, stood up and fought for Jewishness. And although they, what I was about to say was, and they established the last sovereign Jewish kingdom in our indigenous land for over 2,000 years. And yes, while we know that kingdom didn't last, and that is a story for another time, let's say. But that reclaiming of Jewish indigeneity, that reclaiming of Jewish heritage is so vital. I teach classes to non-Jewish students. And I just finished a 3-month class on on Jewish studies. And I opened the class by showing an ancient image of a menorah from over 2,000 years ago. And I showed them this shelf that stands behind me. And usually when it's not Chanukah, I have a Chanukah on it. And I said, look, look at this continuity. This is my apartment in Hong Kong today. This old Chanukah, this old menorah is from thousands of years ago. This continuity, this commitment to Jewish life and this memory is so inspiring. So I believe Chanukah is a Zionist holiday and a Jewish pride holiday.
While we're talking about Chanukah, I would just love to hear, how do you mark the holiday? What are some things that you do? Just think that the audience might be interested to hear.
So I live in Hong Kong, as some of you may know, and I am really the only Jew in kind of my social circles. My partner's not Jewish. So on Sunday, we had a Chanukah party. And there's definitely moments where I miss being surrounded by a Jewish community. That's in person and not online, because obviously we are all part of one community, but I mean kind of directly in kind of my space. But it was really wonderful because I think they expected the party to be eating latkes, eating sufganiyot, having some champagne. And I'm a teacher by trade. So it was almost like I allowed them to get a drink and have some latkes and sufganiyot. And then I whipped out my PowerPoint and we lit the Chanukah. I sang some songs, I explained the story. And then we had a really meaningful conversation about Jewish identity and the reclaiming of Jewish identity and Jewish indigeneity, because we have to understand, especially when we're pursuing allies, that people have been miseducated. Jews have been miseducated, but also, of course, non-Jewish people have. So they may not understand that we're an ethnicity, a nation, a civilization, and they may see us as solely a religious group. So it was a really wonderful kind of opportunity to educate. And every night with my partner, we light the Chanukah, and it's kind of a little embarrassing because on the first night and the fourth night, I posted pictures of my Chanukah. And on the first night, there was so many gelt around the Chanukah, which actually, I have to be honest, were replacement for gelt that I'd already eaten. And then I posted a picture on the fourth night, and my partner and I were like, wow, you can really see how much gelt we've eaten. And it's just really special. I live on the 18th floor of a high rise here in Hong Kong, and I put my Chanukah, I had two in the window, and I'm showing everyone that I'm a proud Jew. And, it was funny when I explained that practice, that we put our Chanukah in the window, my friends were like, oh, that's very on brand for you. And I was like, yeah, because I really love being Jewish and I want the world to know. And I think especially as we're experiencing yet another attempt to kind of destroy or damage our peoplehood, we have to feel our love for it, because what are we fighting for? We're fighting for this incredibly beautiful, rich, diverse culture that we're all a part of. And Chanukah is such a wonderful opportunity to celebrate that.
Couldn't agree with you more. I have a battery operated menorah in my front window, and then we have one that the children made inside, and then another one that's been passed down to me from generation to generation. So we've got three that were all lit today. So yeah, and I feel really strongly about putting mine in my front window also. And I'm totally great when people ask me about it. We have neighbors. I don't live in a particularly Jewish neighborhood here in Toronto, and I'm happy to share some history about it, as you do with your social circle. I do want to mention though, Ben, that we have some beautiful comments in the chat, but we haven't heard any questions yet. So if anybody does have a question, to feel free to ask at any time, and I'm happy to pass it on to Ben. So I wanted to ask you, as we get back to Jewish pride, when we talk about Israel, how integral would you say Israel is to this concept of Jewish pride?
Israel is central. And when I say Israel, I'm not necessarily referring to government or specific leaders, right? I'm talking about the existence of a Jewish state, the state of Israel. So why is that really central to Jewish pride? Well, I mentioned at the beginning when I described kind of my definition of Jewish pride, I mentioned something about authentic Jewish identity. Now, people ask me, what is authentic Jewish identity? Because of course, we are a diverse people. There are many different ways of expressing Jewishness, and that's absolutely true. And we want to celebrate that and encourage that. But all of these have to be rooted in really our historical truths. And what are our historical truths? So what is one of them? That we're a people who are indigenous to the Levant. So what does that mean? That means that we, as a collective, grew, evolved, and maintained ourselves for about 2,000 years. And I think for us living in this part of our history in the diaspora, it may seem really strange or foreign or distant, that connection to Israel, as an indigenous land, not necessarily the modern state of Israel, but that was where our culture developed. So let's think about Rosh Hashanah. I grew up in Glasgow in Scotland. I was about to say with Michael, but not with Michael, but we're both from Glasgow. So it's kind of amazing how high profile Scottish Jews have become. But I ate with my family pomegranate. Pomegranate is not an indigenous fruit to Scotland. I'm quite sure we don't grow pomegranate. That is a fruit that they ate in Israel thousands of years ago. And if we start to understand our practices, all of our practices are rooted around the land. It's about the food that we eat, the festivals, the seasons, it's all central to that land. And yes, we were expelled, and yes, a diaspora formed, but we only left, the diaspora only formed because we were ethnically cleansed and genocided. You know, we did not want to leave our indigenous homeland. And our history, I like to say, was interrupted at that point. And yes, we went forward and we formed beautiful, diverse cultures in the diaspora, like the Sephardic culture, the various Mizrahi culture, of course, Ashkenazi and Yiddish, but they're all iterations of the original culture. We could say that Yiddish culture is a kind of Germanic European version of, Sephardic culture was a Spanish Portuguese version of the original. And I think understanding our identity as an indigenous people is key to understanding our identity, because that shapes, in many cases, how we look, our ancestry, our traditions, our experiences, the things that we do, the things that we say. And I think Israel is central. I really don't believe, actually, it is possible to be a proud Jew and to be an anti-Zionist. And I know that there are Jews who say that. I know that Jews who say, I don't believe in the Jewish right to self-determination, and I'm a proud Jew. But I would say I would really question that, because it's one thing to believe that no state should exist, right? There are people who believe that, but that is not what people who decry Israel are saying. They're saying that Israel as the Jewish state should not exist. And they're saying, or they try to say, that we have no connection to there. So it's really erasing our experience. So it was just a vote, I think, at the United Nations, and they decided to refer to Temple Mount as a solely Muslim site. Now, of course, the Al-Aqsa Mosque is there. It's there to stay. So of course it's connected to Islam, but that's where our temple was. It's called Temple Mount for a reason. That is where our history began. That is where our cultures, even our diasporic cultures, are rooted. And understanding this idea that we are a people, a nation, a civilization, a culture is key for Jewish identity. It's not just that we're a religious group. So I would say that Israel and Zionism is absolutely key and central. But again, that doesn't mean you have to support everything the Israeli government does. I'm sure there are Canadians in this audience in this conversation who don't support everything the Canadian government do, just like I don't necessarily support everything the British government do, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the right to exist, and we're talking about recognizing the historic Jewish connection, and really not just historic and current Jewish connection to this land. It's our home. That's what it is. It's our home.
I see we do have a question about growing up as Jewish in Glasgow and any particular experiences, Jewish experiences that you can share with us. You talked about the pomegranate, but other experiences that people might find interesting. I actually found that very interesting. So.
Yeah, I mean, growing up in Glasgow was amazing. It's an amazing Jewish community. It's very small, very Zionist. And I think Scotland has a small population anyway, but the Jewish population in Scotland is very small. And I think that forces us to be so actively Jewish. You know, I think that we look to Israeli Jews, and some Israeli Jews think, oh, I'm living in the land, it's enough. Even some Jews in New York City say, well, everything around me or many things around me are Jewish, so I don't need to try as hard. We had to try really, really hard. And one of my friends compared being a Jew to like being a witch or a wizard in Harry Potter. And I thought this was the most incredible connection, because my family were Scottish. We lived in the UK, we lived in Scotland, but you opened our door and it's like you entered into a different world. There was pictures with Hebrew on the walls. There was mezuzot. There was the blue JNF-10. There was, Chanukah, and there was candlesticks and everything, and it was so Jewish, and I felt so Jewish growing up. And it wasn't really until later when my Jewishness was challenged at university, because even then the universities were very anti-Jewish, that I kind of started to think about Jewish pride, because I didn't think about it before, because it was just something all around me. You know, my family was Jewish, all our friends were Jewish. I remember when I went to the only Jewish primary school, or the only Jewish school in Scotland, and I remember when I went to high school, and I really thought the world was split into Jews, Christians, and Muslims. I remember speaking to someone and being like, so what's your background? And he's like, oh, I'm just like Scottish. And I'm like, oh, what religion are you? And he said, oh, I'm atheist. And I was like, what? Like, I'd never heard of that. The world to me was so incredibly Jewish. So it was really special. It was hard. Scotland is very left-wing. Even then, we were experiencing everything the world is experiencing now. It was very challenging with Jew hatred. There was a bomb scare at my primary school, Calderwood Lodge Jewish Primary School. Again, when I went to university, it was a daily barrage of hate. And I was called a white supremacist, an imperialist, a colonizer. And I didn't really understand why, because the conversation then was not what it is now on left-wing Jew hate. But overall, I would say I'm very proud to be from Scotland. I'm very proud to stand with Michael and Eve Barlow, of course, who I know did an event with the Friends of Simon and Wiesenthal Centre a few weeks ago, to be a proud Scottish Jew, because there's not that many of us, but we are certainly loud and proud, which is wonderful.
We do have a couple more questions. So Elise is asking, Ben, why do some Jews not feel pride about being Jewish? And what can we as a community, this is a great question, what can we as a community do about that?
It's a really great question. And I guess this is the opportunity to talk about my follow-up book about internalized anti-Jewishness, which comes out next October. Many people, when they think of internalized anti-Jewishness, they think of self-hatred. And I think that is the wrong descriptor. Firstly, it's not about the self. This is something we draw from outside. And it can manifest in Jews who even feel proud. I'm a proud Jew. I wrote the book about Jewish pride. And even in my life, I've said things like, I'm Jewish, but I'm Zionist, but I want to qualify my Jewishness. I want to show the non-Jewish world that I am a good Jew. And who makes these categorizations of good Jew and bad Jew? Well, the non-Jewish world do. So Rabbi Jonathan Sacks said that we see ourselves reflected in the eyes of our non-Jewish neighbors. And I absolutely believe that's true. But kind of an extrapolation in this idea would be the people or the communities who we see ourselves reflected in, they're often very hostile to us. So what they do is they perceive our identity and then they reflect it back to us. You know, we see it in the United States with this idea that Jews are just this white religious group, or even Jews are just a culture. We see the non-Jewish world watering down Jewish identity and experience. And simply because we're a tiny minority, you know, in every country other than Israel, we're a tiny minority. So I think in the UK, it's 2% of the population. I think in Canada, it's around the same, if I'm not mistaken. So we are kind of dealing with the inherent difficulty of integration. We're trying to integrate into societies which at the root are hostile to us. Now that of course is not saying every person is hostile. We have many wonderful allies, but we're talking about society ideology at the core. And I think that is why we don't feel pride in our Jewishness, because we're simply told to be Jewish, to be loudly Jewish, proudly Jewish, specifically Jewish is a bad thing. That is the message that we receive. And if we look at Jewish representation, one of the most common representations of Jews is the demonization of Orthodox Jews, because they're seen as being obstinate and they are archaic and they're oppressive and they won't assimilate, and that's a problem. And I believe that Jews, if they want to, should integrate. But I don't believe, referring back to the Chanukah story, that assimilation is a positive thing for Jews. It's really our enemy. We have fought for thousands of years to survive. And the way we kind of spread Jewish pride, the way we stop or build barriers to internalized anti-Jewishness is by having the conversations, by admitting that this is a problem in our community and doing so without judgment. We have to have empathy. We are a tiny minority. We're the most continuously persecuted minority in the history of the world. And I don't say that to rank our experience. I say that because we can track it historically. So we have a huge amount of trauma. We still experience trauma because of Jew hate today. So we have to approach these conversations with empathy, but we have to inspire, empower, and educate. We have to let Jews know what it means to be a Jew through our experience, not through non-Jewish perceptions of our identity.
So Ben, is internalized anti-Jewishness a big barrier for Jewish pride then?
Absolutely. I think that internalized anti-Jewishness is one of the biggest problems facing our community. And not just today. This has been a problem. I mentioned the men in Greek ruled Judea who were reversing their circumcisions. You know, we had a huge boom of this problem in Germany in the 19th century after emancipation. It's an enormous, enormous barrier because it simply stops us. Every Jew must have an anchor to their Jewishness, and this anchor roots us in our Jewishness, and it helps us withstand kind of the torrents and the winds of Jew hate. But what happens when our anchor is taken away? What happens if we don't even develop one? We can't withstand it. And we know from Jewish experience that that then doesn't mean we just assimilate and we're allowed to integrate into non-Jewish society. We're still othered. So we try our very best to integrate, we try our very best to be accepted, and they still will not let us. So it is absolutely a major barrier. And, you know, I've been on, from this little room in Hong Kong, I've been on kind of a global speaking tour promoting Jewish pride. And in almost every single event, people have asked me about internalized anti-Jewishness, because in the 4th chapter of this book, I have a chapter relating to it, or I have a section relating to it. And in this book, I talk about it in the most extreme way. I talk about anti-Zionist Jews. And in this upcoming book, I'm talking about it much more generally and with much more empathy, and really trying to address the fact that this is a problem in all aspects of the Jewish community, even in the Orthodox community, even in the proud Jewish community.
Well, I look forward to seeing the next book then. So we have a couple more questions here. So we have, do you think that your book, Jewish Pride, expands on the common talk that Jewish parents have with their children? A talk that often focuses on the fact that Jewish people have been unaccepted and continue to be unaccepted by the non-Jewish world. However, regardless, we must remember who we are and take pride in it.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember my mum telling me, you know, I can't remember what age I was, but I remember a conversation where she said, you're an ambassador for the Jewish people. Whenever you leave this house, you have to remember that. And I was like, okay, mom, whatever. And she's right. And you can see that in a negative sense, but also you can see it in a wonderful sense. And absolutely, I think, you know, we hear a lot about the important conversations that Black parents have with their sons, particularly about kind of the dangers of going out into the world as a Black man. And I think we actually have similar conversations in the Jewish community. And absolutely, I think this book is really supposed to help people have these difficult conversations and understand that despite what is said about us, despite what is done to us, we love ourselves regardless. Because I really want people to love their Jewishness. It is remarkable. The fact that we are having this conversation at the end of 2021, you're in Canada, I'm a Scottish Jew in Hong Kong, and the Jews are still talking about Jewish identity. It's a miracle. That's a Chanukah miracle. And it's incredible. Right. And we have to celebrate it. And yes, of course, we have to have real conversations. We're not going to say everything is rainbows and butterflies and everything's coming up roses. We're going to have real conversations, and we do, about the dangers of being a Jew in non-Jewish worlds. But we're also going to preface those conversations and lace those conversations with love and pride, because that is how I felt. I knew that people felt a certain way about us, but I loved it. I loved, you know, the Chagim. I loved, you know, the ritual, lighting the candles. And it also makes a huge difference to our lives. I think if we really start to consider how our kind of key moments in life are made easier or supported by our Jewishness, then our Jewish pride deepens even further.
I wonder if this is all how we become modern Maccabees. Is this the way we do it, by going into the world and listening to the message like your mother had given to you?
Yeah, I really think it is. And I think it's also about being actively Jewish, because remember, the Maccabees were not just fighting the Greeks for the sake of fighting the Greeks or the assimilated Jews. They were fighting to reclaim, they were fighting to rededicate the menorah in the temple, to establish a sovereign Jewish kingdom in our land. And we have to be actively Jewish. Now, I will say, we're all going to be actively Jewish in different ways. I wear a kippah. You can't see it because my hair is so high, but it's a tartan kippah. I wear this every single day. And I don't do this for, you know, religious observance reasons. I do this to show that I'm a proud Jew. And it also reminds me that I'm a Jew. In the morning, once I've done my hair, I clip on my kippah, and it's a constant reminder. And I think we have to incorporate active Jewishness into our lives, because it's not just an idea. It's not just about fighting Jew hate. It is something rich that we can, you know, celebrate and engage with every day. And again, it's going to be different. Some people may choose to read Jewish literature. Some people may choose to read Jewish history. Some people may choose to keep kosher, to wear Jewish symbols, to be actively Jewish. So we're all going to do that in different ways, which is the beauty of our diversity. But I believe we should all be active Jews. And that is, again, the beauty of Chanukah. You know, your 3 Chanukiah, my 2 Chanukiah in the windows of my 18th floor apartment. We're being active. It's not passive. We've never been a passive people. And sometimes when our history is told, particularly by non-Jewish people, we are described as passive. You know, Holocaust education often talks about what is done to Jews. Holocaust movies often focus on the kind of righteous among the nations. So this is us reclaiming our specificity, reclaiming our active Jewishness, because we are a distinct civilization and culture. So we have to nurture that, maintain it. I always say Jewishness does not belong to us. We are caretakers of it to pass it on to the next generation. So that is a responsibility that we have to nurture, to foster, to empower, to make sure that our Jewishness continues long beyond our own lifespans.
So I guess I would say, Ben, that part of the fear, and I know that I've come across this with people in the community, part of the fear of being Jewish, being openly Jewish, of having a Chanukah on your front window, of wearing a Magen David on your chest, you know, is being a target. And so I wonder, and we've seen, you know what, we have a question right now. It feels like anti-Semitism is growing, Tamara writes, and growing here in Canada. And she asks, how does Jewish pride play a role in our community's ability to fight back against this? And also I'll add, and not be afraid.
Yeah. So I'll start with the first part. Absolutely, safety is always paramount. Mm-hmm. We're not telling anyone to go out and put themselves in physical danger. People have to really assess that themselves. But Jewish pride can also be a personal thing. You know, if you're not safe, you don't need to put your Chanukah in the window, because it's about you. This is both individual and collective. So we will all find our individual ways to kind of navigate this very difficult world. You know, my own mother called me in May and said, should I be wearing my Magen David out? And I said, if you feel comfortable wearing it, wear it. You can maybe put it underneath your top. Or if you don't feel safe, you can take it off. But that doesn't make you not a proud Jew. You're a proud Jewish woman who's raised 3 Jewish children, one of whom wrote a book about Jewish pride and the other 2 made Aliyah. Like, you know, you're a proud Jewish woman. You don't need this Magen David. It's wonderful when we can show it to the world. But absolutely, we have to recognize the terrain, and the non-Jewish worlds don't always make it safe for us. And I think with regards to how Jewish pride helps us fight Jew hate, it tells us we can. Jews are often told, keep your head down, don't say anything. That was the kind of culture when I was growing up. And I honestly, I mean, probably much to my parents' dismay, was always just too obnoxious and loud to do that. I always have something to say for anyone who knows me. So I couldn't. And but we are told to keep our heads down. One of the reasons this book, this idea came to me, was I was on Twitter fighting Jeremy Corbyn in the UK. Jeremy Corbyn was the former leader of the Labour Party, who is a racist against Jews, and he actively targeted the British Jewish community, and many of us were terrified. And I saw 2 things. First thing I saw was British Jews rise up and fight. We took to the streets and we said we said enough is enough. I also saw Jews who were not able to fight. Jews who were saying, he's not really anti-Jewish, or yeah, he might be anti-Jewish, but his other goals are more important. Jewish pride tells us we're allowed to center ourselves. We are allowed to advocate for ourselves. I talk about Jewish people because I am a Jew, and I'm not going to apologize for that. I advocate for Jewish people because I am a Jew. That is my right. I'm not going to sacrifice myself for other communities while ignoring the very real experience of my own. So Jewish pride tells us that we have a voice, and we're allowed to use it, and we're allowed to talk about ourselves. We're allowed to feel the shame, the pain, the trauma, where we don't have to bury it. We can feel it, we live it. But it also ultimately tells us that we're going to fight with pride. We fight because we love ourselves. We love being Jewish, and that's what we're fighting for. And because ultimately we know that we deserve better, because the non-Jewish world has told us for thousands and thousands of years that we don't deserve better, that we don't deserve a place in society, that we don't deserve a place in the world. And we say, no, that is not true. We deserve to be here, and we're going to fight for our rights because we love being Jewish, and we see the value in that, even if they don't.
You talked about your own experience in university, and now we're talking about anti-Semitism, and there is an issue with anti-Semitism on college campuses. And we have Avital who's writing about it, and she says, right now there is a big problem of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment at our universities, and Jewish students feel isolated and they feel silenced. How can students take back their pride in being Jewish, even though they sometimes exist in hostile spaces?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the issue of Jew hatred on college campuses is incredibly important, and it's incredibly serious. the first thing that we have to help Jewish students realize is knowledge. They have to know, we all have to know, that what the non-Jewish world says about us are lies. They're lies. Israel is not an imperialist state. It's not a colonizer. It's not a racist state. It's not a Nazi state. It's not a white state. We have to know the truth. We have to know that we are indigenous to that land. And with that education comes power. And it really also brings us armor, because it helps us defend and deflect against what is being said. Listen, it will still be painful. It is still painful. When I experienced what I experienced at university, it was painful, but I knew they were lying. I was like, no, you're the backwards one, not me. Zionism is a movement is actually of progressive values. It's the most successful decolonization movement in the history of mankind. We need to know that. We need to know our history, know the Zionist movement, know about the realities of Israel, both the good and the bad. We're not going to pretend that Israel's a perfect state, but that's not what Zionism is centered on. And that armor is so important because A, that helps Jewish students spread that information to people who are open and willing to learn. And it also helps them withstand what is being said. And then the simple act of a Jewish student, who may walk past an anti-Jewish poster, which is traumatic, and we're not going to minimize that. We're going to understand that, discuss that, unpack that trauma. But the power of them going back to their apartment and lighting a Chanukah, the symbol of Jewish resistance, of Jewish pride, of Zionism, is so incredibly powerful, because really what we have to stop doing is putting stop valuing the opinion of the non-Jewish world with regards to Jewish identity. And it doesn't make it not hard. It's still hard, but Jewish pride is a barrier and it is armor, and it certainly helps.
I wonder if the same could be said for the LGBTQ plus community. We have Owen, who's writing about being a deaf, queer Jew and saying it's a struggle sometimes dealing with the way LGBTQ plus groups and disability groups, he says, seem to gloss over anti-Semitism as if it's not happening. And so he's asking, how do we deal with this? And I wonder if maybe the same sort of advice you've given to students might apply to that community as well.
Absolutely. It's about knowing the truth, knowing the facts, knowing that Israel is the best and safest place for LGBTQ plus people in Asia, not just in the Middle East, in Asia. And we need to know that the people who make accusations of pink washing, which is the accusation that Israel purposely raises its record on LGBTQ rights to kind of diminish what is being done to the Palestinians, we know that they're wrong. We know that there are many LGBTQ plus Jewish activists and advocates out there, that there is a place for us in parts of our community. And, one of the things that often happens when we experience rejection by the non-Jewish world, it makes us doubt our identities. But while I do not necessarily feel comfortable in LGBTQ plus spaces any longer because of the Jew hatred, that doesn't stop me being a gay man. While I do not feel comfortable being in progressive spaces because of Jew hatred, that doesn't stop me having progressive values. So that kind of inherent knowledge about our own experience, our own identities is vital. And that's why, I feel so passionate about education. I'm a teacher, and all of this has to start with education. Education really is the first form of activism. And we as a community have to come together to really consider, how are we educating ourselves, let alone going out into the world to kind of try and find allyship. But it's also okay to walk away from spaces. I am kind of famous for cutting people off who have committed microaggressions against me, because I don't have time for that. If I explain to them and they're apologetic and they understand, that's no problem, right? Everyone deserves a second chance. But people who are repeat offenders, you can walk away from friendships, you can walk away from relationships, because we do not have to stay in spaces where we are not welcome. We have enough self-esteem, we value ourselves enough, and we know that we do matter, again, regardless of what they say.
Well, that's very empowering. I think that's a great message. I was going to ask you, you talked a little bit about what's coming up in your next project. I was going to ask you for a preview, and I see Lenora is also asking. In fact, she's asking, what's the title of your new book and when will it be available for purchase? So there you go. Everybody wants to know.
So I'm actually turning it into a trilogy, and everyone I tell that to laughs, because they're like, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, and I'm not going to be creating a language. we already have a language. I don't need to create one. The second book is, the working title at the moment is Jewish Pride, Reclaiming Our Story. If we understand internalized anti-Jewishness, it has many various manifestations. Some of it's extreme, some of it is more subtle, some of it leads us to change our names, our noses, some of it leads us to just deny our experience altogether. So there is a diversity in how this manifests. So when I was defining it, I want to define it via its source, via the reason. And the reason, I believe, is when Jewish people allow the non-Jewish world to define Jewish narrative and identity. And then when we accept that as truth. So it's about reclaiming our story. The third book, which actually I've never told anyone this title, but I will, the working title for this is, and this may, don't hold it to me. If it changes, don't be like, hey, you said, but it's going to be called Jewish Pride, A Way Home, because I really believe that understanding our indigeneity is key. And in this Jewish studies course that I taught last term, I spent about 8 weeks in the first 2,000 years of Jewish history, understanding, teaching what that means. And I think if Jewish people understand that as a collective, we are indigenous to the land of Israel, that has to have an impact on our identity. The third book has not even begun yet. It is literally just a twinkle in my eye. The second book is due to be released, I think, on October 25th, 2022. So next October. And I'm also going to be at some point writing a children's book, because Jewish Pride is for everyone. And we focus so much of our education, which is kind of unusual because this is actually not reflective, I think, the wider world. So much of our education focuses on young adults or adults. And actually, we have to really speak to children about Jewish pride, because if we, give them the tools, them the skills, them the inspirement, if that's even a word, empowerment and education, then it will not be a problem later on. So those are kind of the projects I'm working on in the future or currently.
Well, you haven't written the children's book yet, but you already have a bunch of people who say they're going to probably buy into it, because Romy and Suzanne and Ashley are all talking about the need for this in the children's space. And in fact, Ashley writes, I work in children's television and I'm so excited about your new venture. When do we get to see a Jewish Muppet?
Yeah, so I have just signed a deal with the Jim Henson Company, and they're going to be working on a couple of TV projects that feature Jewish characters. And I'm really just so amazed that they want to reach out to us. They want to reach out to the Jewish community, because they understand that the best people to tell Jewish stories are Jews. That's just it. So they wanted to get a Jewish voice. So I'll be working on that. I cannot reveal anything about it, obviously, but all will be revealed in due course. And I think it will be very exciting. And the beauty of this is that it will help Jewish children feel represented, because I never did as a child, either as a Jew or a gay person. But it's also going to inform non-Jewish children and their families about the Jewish experience. So it's really a wonderful way to educate non-Jewish people and hopefully cultivate allies.
So Ben, something that we've seen, unfortunately, is sometimes Jewish people actively advocating against Israel and diminishing the problem of anti-Semitism. And so one question we have here is, in noting that they can do real damage for our community's fight against anti-Semitism, and asking, how do we address this problem as a community? What do we do about this?
Well, I think we have to address it. We have to have very clear boundaries. We have to have very clear notions of what constitutes a proud Jew. And I know that may sound complicated, because again, 3 Jews, 15 opinions, but we have to be operating within a framework. You cannot deny historical truth. And this is something we've seen for really thousands of years, Jews cooperating with those who try to harm us. And that is not really different from kids at my school trying to fit in with the people who are maybe picking on them or bullying them because they think they're cool. We all want to be accepted. We all want to feel part of a group. And I think what we need to do is recognize the problem, educate people about what they're saying and why what they're saying isn't true, and really get to the root of what they're saying. It's not just that these are non-Jews advocating against Israel. These are Jews. There is a reason for that. It is internalized anti-Jewishness. The major problem with this is if someone is so steeped in internalized anti-Jewishness, they may not be able to have introspection about their own experience. But I do think we have to have empathy, of course. We have to understand that this is a non-Jewish problem that has impacted Jews. But when a Jewish person uses their Jewish identity, they deploy their Jewish identity to harm other Jews, then yes, absolutely, we have to be very clear and strong about this. And, you know, I'm not saying that we should be excommunicating. That is not my conversation. It's not my kind of decision. But I do think if someone strays so far from authentic Jewish values, we have to ask, are they even still Jews? And again, I'm not saying there's just one way to be Jewish. There is not. But we are working within a framework. We're working within a civilization that has developed over thousands of years. So we have to recognize that these Jews are really working against us and their own authentic identity. And also it's the tragic fact that at some point they too will be rejected by the non-Jewish world. That always happens. Token Jews are always rejected ultimately.
Yeah, I think, Ben, it really starts with education. And that's why it's so important, you know, that you do what you do, that you continue to write these books, and the children's book, which seems to be, again, very popular in the chat tonight. And so maybe, you know, we have just a couple more minutes. And so as we focus on children, you know, Chanukah is such a celebration for children in my home, and I'm sure in many of the households that are joining us tonight. I wonder, how do you have this conversation with children about Jewish pride, you know, about being comfortable being yourself and being Jewish, especially children who, you know, grow up in neighborhoods that aren't predominantly Jewish?
Absolutely. And I think it's a question many of us have to be considering, right? Because we don't want to traumatize children. We don't want to scare them. We do have to help them understand the reality. But I think the first step is having children light the Chanukah. What a beautiful, tangible memory. Act of Jewishness, you know, saying Hamotzi, saying Kiddush, things that really anchor them to their Jewishness, because that's what we have to do with children. We have to anchor them in their Jewishness, again, to help them withstand everything that comes at them. And it's really to talk about it and to say, look at the Maccabees, look at these people, these Jews who were living in this land, living in our land, that was being ruled by people who didn't like us very much, and they didn't like the way we did things, and they wanted to stamp out because they thought their way was better. Look, these people, our ancestors, say to the children, your ancestors said no. We know that being Jewish is special. We know that being Jewish is a beautiful thing. Look at the beautiful, ritual that we've just taken part in lighting the Chanukah. And make it something joyous, because so often in Jewish education and Jewish experience, we lose our joy. There is so much joy in being Jewish. And that is really what we have to get back to. So we have to instill our children with Jewish joy, Jewish pride. And then when they're able, when they're ready, we have conversations about not everyone sees us this way. And I think framing it that way is really important. It's, we know who we are. We know how beautiful and special it is to be Jewish. There's some people who don't see that. And like we can say, you know, with children, you don't let someone else, sticks and stones may break my bones, right? You know who you are. You know that when we come home and we get together as a family and we say Kiddush and we say the Hamotzi and we eat challah, that's a beautiful thing. And always connecting it to the history, because there is a thread running through our experience. Each of us is a thread in a much greater tapestry of Jewishness, and that extends far back into the past and will extend far into the future. And I just want to say, there are organizations, or there are countries in the world who have been slower to respond to this threat. And I want to, as a British Jew who experienced Jeremy Corbyn and what was done to the Jewish community in the UK, congratulate and honor the Canadian Jewish community who has really seen it for what it is, not buried their heads in the sand. And particularly an organization like Friends of the Simon Wiesenthal Centre, who has really responded very quickly. And that's not something we have seen in other parts of the Jewish diaspora, but it is something to celebrate, because ultimately, clearly, Canadian Jews have Jewish pride because they know that we deserve better. The Friends of the Simon Wiesenthal Centre say, no, this isn't right. We're not going to accept this treatment. We're going to advocate for ourselves because what you say about us is wrong.
What a perfect point to end on. Ben, such a pleasure to listen to you and to chat with you. And I know that, myself, and it seems to be certainly the people in the chat tonight, can't wait for your next book to come out. So we'll look for the rest of the trilogy: Jewish Pride, Reclaiming Our Story, potentially Jewish Pride, A Way Home, and whatever children's book that you do work on. Thank you so much, Ben, for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I'll say that we are so privileged to have had Ben with us tonight. It is so important in this moment of growing anti-Semitism that we really never do lose sight of what it means to be Jewish, of being proud of who we are. And I also want to thank, of course, as Ben mentioned, the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center for organizing this program tonight. And to all of the synagogues, the many synagogues that have supported this event. And finally, I want to thank all of our participants tonight, our audience, with some fantastic questions. And I just wish you all a happy Chanukah, Chag Sameach. Thank you for being with us. I'm Caryn Lieberman, and good night.